When millionaire cattle baron Tyson Beck kissed the woman they called cursed, three things happened at once. The drought broke, his enemies fell silent, and every rose in Copper Canyon bloomed out of season. But that kiss was still 3 days away, and Tyson Beck had no idea his carefully ordered world was about to shatter like glass against stone. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning when the sun hung merciless over his sprawling ranch, baking the earth until it cracked like old leather. Tyson stood on his wraparound porch, boots planted wide, reading the same 5 words over and over. Your bride arrives Thursday noon. His jaw tightened. The marriage broker in Denver had assured him this arrangement would solve his problems. A suitable wife to quiet the gossips, bear him heirs, and grace his dinner table with civilized conversation. What he hadn't expected was the woman's reputation to arrive ahead of her like a plague wind. Boss Knox Greer, his foreman, approached with the cautious steps of a man walking through a minefield. Dust clung to his weathered face, and sweat darkened his shirt despite the early hour. That telegram. It's about the lady from back east. Miss Indy Prescott. Tyson folded the paper with sharp creases, the sound crisp as breaking bones. Seems the whole territory's been talking. Knox shifted his weight, his weathered face creased with worry lines deep as canyon walls. What they're saying ain't natural, boss. 3 husbands dead, each one within a year of marrying her. Crops failing wherever she settles. And that business in Missouri with the preacher's son, superstitious nonsense. But even as Tyson spoke the words, something cold unfurled in his chest. He'd heard the stories himself, whispered in saloons and spread through sewing circles like wildfire through dry grass. Maybe. But Ronan Vega's been spreading word she's cursed. Got half the town spooked already. Mrs. Bishop won't even speak the woman's name out loud, just crosses herself and mutters prayers. At the mention of his rival's name, Tyson's blood simmered. Ronan Vega, owner of the competing Silver Star Ranch, poisoner of wells both literal and metaphorical. The man had been circling Tyson's troubles like a buzzard, waiting for the right moment to swoop down and claim what remained of the Beck empire. If Vega was stirring up trouble about his bride-to-be, it meant the man sensed weakness. And Tyson Beck had built his fortune on reading weakness in others and never showing his own. Let them talk, he said, but his knuckles whitened around the telegram until the paper crumpled. I didn't claw my way up from dirt poor to bow to small town. Superstition. That was the truth, if not the whole truth. The whole truth lived buried deeper, in memories of his father's fists and his mother's tears, in the shame of wearing patched clothes to school while other children snickered behind cupped hands. Money had armored him against that shame, but some wounds never fully healed. They just learned to hide better, like snakes coiled in tall grass. Knox lingered, hat in his hands. There's more, boss. Mira Travers over at the general store says. Miss Prescott sent ahead a list. Requested unusual supplies, such as herbs, strange ones with names I can't even pronounce, glass bottles, silver chains, candles made from beeswax, and something else she wouldn't specify. Things a normal bride wouldn't need for keeping house. Tyson turned toward the horizon where heat waves shimmered like dancing spirits. 3 years of drought had turned his empire brittle as autumn leaves. Cattle dying, wells running dry, creditors circling like vultures drawn to carrion. He needed this marriage, needed the substantial dowry that came with Miss Prescott, needed the respectability, needed the alliance with her late father's railroad connections back east. What he didn't need was a wife who practiced whatever dark arts she might practice. Double the hands watching the property, he told Knox, his voice steady as stone. And send word to Maisie Hollis at the boarding house. Tell her to prepare the best room for my bride. I want everything perfect. When she arrives, fresh flowers, clean linens, the works. Knox nodded and turned to go, then paused, his boot heel grinding against the porch boards. Boss, what if the stories are true? What if she really is? Tyson's smile was sharp as a blade fresh from the whetstone. Then God help anyone who stands in my way. The foreman left, but his question lingered like smoke from a dying fire. Tyson had built his reputation on certainty, on never showing doubt or fear to friend or enemy alike. But standing alone on his porch, watching dust devils dance across his parched land like restless spirits, He felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood. The cold touch of the unknown in town. The whispers had already begun to multiply and spread. Heard tell she talks to shadows, murmured Eloan Bishop, the preacher's wife, as she sorted through fabric at Myra's store. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. And that laugh of hers, like wind through a graveyard at midnight. Mira. Travers nodded grimly, her fingers counting coins with nervous precision. Those herbs she ordered? Moonshade and Devil's Claw, Wolfsbane, and something called Widow's Weep. Ain't nothing Christian about plants like that. Makes a body wonder what kind of rituals she's planning. Poor Mr. Beck, Eloan continued, clutching her shawl tighter despite the oppressive heat. Man's got troubles enough without bringing a hex into his house. Mark my words, no good can come of joining with such a creature. But not everyone spoke against the mysterious bride. Young Maisie Hollis, barely 18 and full of romantic notions fed by dime novels, defended the woman she'd never met. Maybe she's just misunderstood, Maisie argued, sweeping the boarding house steps with unusual vigor. Maybe those men died of natural causes, and folks are just looking for someone to blame. Maybe she's beautiful and lonely, and people fear what they don't understand. Natural causes don't follow a woman like a pet dog, Mira replied sharply. 3 husbands, child. 3. And not one of them lasting more than a year before meeting his maker. As Thursday approached, an odd tension settled over Copper Canyon like storm pressure before a twister. Dogs howled at nothing but empty air. Horses shied from shadows that held no substance. Even the weather seemed to hold its breath, as if the very sky was waiting for something momentous to unfold. The whistle of the approaching train cut through the desert air like a knife, carrying with it a cargo that would change everything and everyone it touched. The train arrived precisely at noon, belching steam and cinders into the merciless sky. Tyson Beck stood on the platform in his finest black suit, sweat already beading beneath his collar despite the early hour. Half the town had found excuses to loiter nearby. Suddenly, everyone needed supplies from Myra's store or had urgent business at the depot. Knox flanked him on the right, hand resting casual-like on his gun belt. 2 other ranch hands positioned themselves near the baggage car, their presence more statement than necessity. Tyson Beck didn't do anything halfway, especially not collecting a bride who'd already set tongues wagging from here to Santa Fe. The passenger car door opened with a metallic screech that seemed to echo longer than it should. A conductor stepped down, then turned to offer his hand to someone still hidden within the shadowy interior. Easy now, ma'am. Mind the step. The first thing that emerged was a gloved hand, black leather, supple as a second skin. Then a boot, practical but elegant, followed by the sweep of midnight blue traveling dress that caught the light like water. But it was when Indy Prescott stepped fully into the blazing New Mexico sun that the whispers died as surely as if someone had cut every throat in town. She was beautiful, yes, but not in any way Tyson had expected. Where he'd imagined a pale, delicate eastern flower, he found instead a woman carved from storm clouds and shadow. Her hair was black as sin, twisted into an intricate arrangement that left her neck exposed. Her skin held the kind of pallor that spoke of careful cultivation rather than weakness. And her eyes were the color of deep water just before it turns to ice. She surveyed the gathered crowd with a gaze that seemed to catalog each face, each whispered word, each barely concealed fear. When her attention finally settled on Tyson, something passed between them, recognition, perhaps, or challenge. He couldn't be sure which. Mr. Beck. Her voice carried the hint of an accent he couldn't place, something older than the eastern cities, something that belonged to moonlight and midnight rather than drawing rooms and tea service. Miss Prescott. He stepped forward, removing his hat. Welcome to Copper Canyon. She accepted his offered arm with fingertips light as bird bones. But he felt the strength in her grip, the coiled energy that suggested she could hold her own in ways that had nothing to do with embroidery or managing servants. I trust your journey wasn't too arduous, no more than expected. Her smile was a blade wrapped in silk. Though I confess the landscape is more dramatic than I anticipated. Behind them, the conductor and porters began unloading her belongings. Tyson had expected the usual female traveling accoutrements, hat boxes, dress trunks, perhaps a few books. Instead, Trunk after trunk emerged from the baggage car, each one locked with mechanisms more complex than anything he'd seen outside a bank vault. Knox appeared at his elbow, voice low. "Boss, that's the 7th trunk. How much does one woman need?" Before Tyson could respond, Indy turned toward them, and Knox actually took a step backward. There was something in her gaze that reminded Tyson of a cat watching a mouse. Not cruel, exactly, but utterly aware of the power dynamic at play. "I'm afraid I travel with certain necessities," she said, as if she'd heard Knox's whisper from 20 feet away. "A woman must be prepared for any eventuality." "Of course." Tyson gestured toward the wagon. "We'll have everything transported to the ranch immediately. I've arranged for you to stay at the boarding house until we can make proper arrangements." How thoughtful. But her smile suggested she found his careful propriety amusing rather than charming. As they walked toward the wagon, Tyson became acutely aware of the silence that followed in their wake. Even the children had stopped their usual depot games to stare. Old Henrik, the blacksmith, crossed himself as they passed. Mrs. Chun, who ran the laundry, actually stepped behind her husband as if seeking protection. Only young Maisie Hollis seemed immune to the general unease. She practically bounced on her toes as they approached the boarding house, her romantic heart clearly enchanted by the mysterious newcomer. "Oh, Miss Prescott," she exclaimed. "Your dress is just beautiful. Is it the latest fashion from back east?" Indy's expression softened slightly, the first genuine warmth Tyson had seen from her. "Thank you, dear. Though I'm afraid my tastes run more toward the practical than the fashionable." "Practical?" Maisie's eyes widened. "But you look like a princess from one of my story books." "Appearances," Indy murmured, "can be deceiving." As they climbed the boarding house steps, Tyson found himself studying his bride-to-be more closely. Her movements held an odd quality, too graceful, too controlled, like she was consciously thinking about each step. And there was something else, something that nagged at the edges of his awareness. "The heat doesn't seem to affect you," he observed. She paused, one hand on the door frame. "I suppose I'm accustomed to warmer climates." It was then that he realized what had been bothering him. Despite the blazing sun, despite the oppressive heat that had sweat running down his back, Indy Prescott showed no sign of discomfort. No perspiration dampened her brow, no flush colored her pale cheeks. She looked as cool and composed as if she'd just stepped from an air-conditioned palace. Inside the boarding house, Maisie bustled about, showing off the room she'd prepared with obvious pride. Fresh flowers, the last hardy blooms from her struggling garden, graced the washstand. Clean linens beckoned from the narrow bed. Sunlight streamed through spotless windows. "It's perfect," Indy said, and this time her smile seemed genuine. "Thank you for your kindness, Miss Hollis." "Maisie Hollis. And it's no trouble at all. We so rarely get visitors, especially ones as interesting as yourself." Tyson cleared his throat. "I thought perhaps you'd like to rest today. Tomorrow we could discuss arrangements, the wedding plans." "Of course." Indy moved to the window, gazing out at the dusty street below. "Though I confess, I'm curious about your town. Perhaps this evening I might take a walk, get acquainted with my new home." Every protective instinct Tyson possessed screamed against the idea. The mood in town was ugly, and after dark, with liquor loosening tongues and courage, who knew what some fool might do? "I'm not sure that's wise. Perhaps I could escort you." "That's very gallant, Mr. Beck. But I've grown accustomed to my own company." She turned from the window, and for just a moment, her eyes seemed to catch and hold the light in an entirely unnatural way. "Besides, I find darkness much more accommodating than daylight." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Indy Prescott prepared for her first night in Copper Canyon. But she wouldn't be walking alone, and what she planned to encounter in the shadows would test every assumption the town had made about the woman they called Cursed. Indy Prescott waited until the boarding house settled into sleep before she made her move. Through thin walls, she could hear Maisie's gentle snoring, the creak of old wood cooling in the desert night, the distant lowing of cattle restless in their pens. But there was something else threading through the darkness, whispers that had nothing to do with human voices. She dressed in black from head to toe, her traveling dress exchanged for something that moved like liquid shadow. From the largest of her locked trunks, She withdrew items that would have sent the God-fearing citizens of Copper Canyon fleeing into the night. A silver blade curved like a crescent moon, glass vials filled with substances that seemed to glow with their own inner light, and a leather-bound journal whose pages whispered secrets when the wind turned them. The back door of the boarding house opened silently under her touch. Locks had always bent to her will, just as shadows had always welcomed her passage. She stepped into the alley, breathing deeply of air that tasted of dust, fear, and something darker that most people couldn't detect: magic. Old magic that ran beneath this desert like underground rivers, pooling in places where violence had been done, where blood had soaked into earth that remembered everything. Indy smiled, and in the moonlight, her teeth gleamed sharp as promises. She wasn't the first of her kind to walk these streets. The land itself told her that, whispered stories of others who'd come before, drawn by the same currents that had pulled her west like iron filings to a magnet. But she might be the first to stay, the first to sink roots deep enough to change what grew here. Her footsteps made no sound as she moved through the sleeping town, but she wasn't alone. Shadows detached themselves from buildings, flowing alongside her like loyal hounds. Most people would have seen only darkness, but Indy saw the truth: spirits of the restless dead, drawn by her presence like moths to flame. "Show me," she whispered. To the darkness, and the shadows responded. They led her first to the cemetery on the hill overlooking town, where weathered headstones told stories of lives cut short by violence, disease, and the 100 small tragedies that followed settlers into untamed lands. But it was the newer graves that caught her attention: 3 men, all young, all buried within the past 5 years, all killed by the same hand. She knelt beside the fresh-turned earth of the most recent grave, placing her palm flat against soil that still held traces of what had happened here. Images flooded her mind: torchlight dancing across angry faces, the sound of rope cutting through air, the desperate gasps of a man who'd committed no crime except falling in love with the wrong person's daughter. "Ronan Vega," she breathed, tasting the name like poison on her tongue. The shadows around her stirred restlessly, responding to the hatred that seeped from her like perfume. Now she understood why she'd been called here, why the currents of power had insisted she accept Tyson Beck's marriage proposal sight unseen. It wasn't about the money or the respectability or even the loneliness that had driven her from town to town, always running from whispers that followed her like hungry ghosts. That it was about justice. She rose and continued through the town, her supernatural senses cataloging every detail. The general store where Mira Travers counted coins with trembling fingers, haunted by guilt over her silence when innocence had died. The church where Eloan Bishop knelt in prayer, begging forgiveness for cowardice disguised as piety. The saloon, where men drank to forget things they'd done in darkness, things that followed them home and whispered in their dreams. But it was at the edge of town, where the Silver Star Ranch sprawled across stolen land, that she felt the strongest pull. Evil had weight, and Ronan Vega's evil had been feeding on this place for years, growing fat on fear and blood and the tears of widows who knew better than to speak the truth. She found him in his study, bent over ledgers that recorded profits, built on other people's suffering. Even from outside, even through walls and windows, she could smell the corruption on him. Not just moral decay, but something deeper, something that had begun to eat him from the inside out like a cancer of the soul. Ronan Vega was already cursed. He just didn't know it yet. Indy placed her hand against the window, and frost spread across the glass despite the warm night air. Inside, Vega looked up from his books, sudden unease prickling across his skin. He couldn't see her, couldn't know she was there, but men like him always sensed when their reckoning approached. Soon, she promised the darkness, and every shadow in town seemed to shiver in anticipation. She was turning to leave when footsteps approached, too heavy to belong to any of Vega's men, too confident to belong to someone who meant her harm. She melted deeper into shadow, becoming one with the darkness until even her own kind would have had trouble finding her. Tyson Beck emerged from the gloom, and Indy's breath caught. He moved through the night like he owned it, his presence commanding even in the absence of light. But there was something else about him, something that made her step closer despite every instinct screaming caution that he was scarred. Not physically, though. She sensed old wounds on his body, but deeper than that. Scarred in places where love should have grown, where trust should have taken root. Someone had hurt him badly, had taught him that caring was weakness, and that the only safe place was behind walls built of money and reputation. She found herself wondering what it would feel like to heal those scars, to watch warmth bloom in. Eyes that had learned to show the world nothing but steel. The thought should have terrified her. In all her years of running, of hiding, of using her gifts to survive in a world that feared what it didn't understand, she'd never once considered staying for a man. Never once imagined that someone might be worth the risk. But as she watched Tyson Beck stand in the darkness, staring up at stars that seemed closer here in the desert than they had anywhere else she'd lived, something shifted inside her chest. Something that felt dangerously like hope that he couldn't see her, couldn't know she was there. But when he spoke into the night air, his words carried to her ears as clearly as if he'd whispered them directly into her soul. "I don't know what you are," he said softly, and she knew he was speaking to her, somehow sensing her presence even through her concealment. "But I know you're not what they say you are. Question is, what are you really?" Indy smiled, and this time there was nothing sharp about it, nothing dangerous. For the first time in years, someone was asking the right question. But before she could decide whether to answer, the sound of approaching horses shattered the desert silence, and Ronan Vega's voice carried across the darkness, promising violence. That would test everything she thought she knew about the man who'd hired her as his bride. The sound of hoofbeats thundered across the desert like war drums, growing louder with each passing second. Indy counted at least 6 riders, maybe more, moving fast, and with purpose that had nothing to do with late-night cattle business. She pressed deeper into the shadows, every instinct screaming danger, but found herself unable to retreat while Tyson Beck stood exposed in the open ground between buildings. "Beck," Ronan Vega's voice cut through the night like a blade. "I know you're out there. Time we had ourselves a conversation." Tyson didn't move, didn't even flinch at the threat in Vega's tone. He simply stood his ground, hands loose at his sides, looking for all the world like a man who'd been expecting this confrontation. "Vega, out late, aren't you? Respectable ranchers are usually in bed by now." Laughter erupted from the mounted men. Harsh, ugly sound that made Indy's skin crawl. These weren't cowboys or ranch hands. These were the kind of men who hired themselves out for work decent folks wouldn't do. The kind who measured their worth in other people's fear. Vega urged his horse closer, close enough that torchlight revealed his face, handsome in a cold way, with eyes that held all the warmth of winter stars. "Heard your bride finally arrived. Shame about her reputation. My personal affairs don't concern you." "Oh, but they do." Vega dismounted with fluid grace, his hand resting casual-like on his gun butt. "See, that woman you're planning to marry? She's brought something dark into our town, something that needs to be dealt with before it spreads." From her hiding place, Indy watched the scene unfold with growing understanding. This wasn't about her reputation or the whispered stories that had followed her west. This was about power, about Vega using fear as a weapon to destroy his rival's credibility. If he could paint Tyson's bride as a witch, if he could stir up enough panic. "You sound mighty sure about things you couldn't possibly know," Tyson said, his voice deadly quiet. "Makes a man wonder what you've been up to while the rest of us sleep." Something flickered across Vega's face, too fast for most people to catch. But Indy had spent years reading the subtle tells of dangerous men. Guilt, fear, and underneath it all, something else that made her blood run cold: recognition. Vega knew exactly what she was because he'd dealt with her kind before. "I know enough," Vega said. "Know she ordered herbs that ain't fit for Christian purposes. Know she carries things in those trunks that would make your hair stand on end. And I know 3 good men died after saying, 'I do' to that creature." 3 men died, Tyson agreed, and Indy heard something new in his voice, steel wrapped in silk, the tone of a man who'd done his own research. 3 men who all had the misfortune to cross paths with men like you before they met their ends. The night air seemed to thicken around them. Vega's hired guns shifted in their saddles, hands drifting toward weapons. Even the horses seemed to sense the violence brewing, pawing at the earth and rolling their eyes white. "That's a dangerous accusation, Beck." "Is it an accusation? I thought it was just an observation." Tyson's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Funny how misfortune seems to follow certain people around, isn't it? Like that farmer's son in Missouri. Heard tell he was asking too many questions about water rights before he took that tumble down his own well. Indy's breath caught. The farmer's son, that had been her second husband, a sweet boy who'd married her for love and died 3 months later when he'd gotten too close to the truth about who really controlled the water in his county. She'd run that same night, leaving behind a wedding ring and another set of rumors about the cursed bride who brought death in her wake. But Tyson knew. Somehow, he'd dug deep enough to uncover the real story. "You're walking a thin line, Beck," Vega snarled, his composure finally cracking. "Keep pushing, and you might find yourself taking a tumble of your own." Might. Tyson's hand moved with lightning speed, and suddenly his Colt was aimed steady at Vega's chest. "Or you might find out what happens when you threaten the wrong man's bride." The world held its breath. 6 guns against one should have been no contest. But there was something in Tyson's stance, something in the way he held that weapon, that made even hired killers think twice about their odds. That's when Indy made her choice. She stepped out of the shadows like mist given form, her black dress flowing around her like liquid night. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in an instant, and frost began forming on the windows of nearby buildings despite the desert heat. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in the bones of everyone present. What an interesting way to spend an evening. The horses reared and screamed, their primal instincts recognizing something their riders' rational minds refused to accept. 2 of Vega's men actually crossed themselves, while a third whispered what might have been a prayer or a curse. But it was Vega's reaction that confirmed her suspicions. His face went pale as milk, and his hand shook as he reached for something hidden inside his coat. Not a gun, but something wrapped in silver chain and reeking of old fear. "You," he breathed. "I should have known you'd find your way here eventually." "Hello, Ronan." Indy's smile was winter-given form. "It's been a long time." Tyson's gun never wavered, but she saw his eyes flick between them, saw the moment he realized. This confrontation had roots that went deeper than simple business rivalry. "You two know each other?" "Oh yes," Indy said, her attention fixed on Vega like a cat watching a cornered mouse. "Mr. Vega and I have crossed paths before. Haven't we, Ronan? Though you were using a different name then." "What was it? Yes. Roman Vaughn. You always did have a weakness for simple alterations." Vega's hand closed around whatever he'd been reaching for, and power crackled through the air. Not the clean, natural magic that flowed through Indy like water, but something twisted and dark, something that reeked of grave dirt and spilled blood. "You should have stayed buried in whatever hole you crawled out of," he hissed. "Some mistakes don't get second chances." "No," Indy agreed, and shadows began flowing toward her like iron filings drawn to a magnet. "They don't." The desert night erupted into chaos as 2 kinds of darkness collided, and in the space between heartbeats, Tyson Beck realized his bride-to-be was about to show him exactly why 3 husbands had died, and why she might be the only woman alive capable of killing the thing that called itself Ronan Vega. The battle that followed would be whispered about in Copper Canyon for generations to come, though most who witnessed it would never speak of what they truly saw. Years later, they'd claim it was just a gunfight between rival ranchers, just bad men meeting bad ends under a desert moon. But Tyson Beck would remember every impossible detail until his dying day. Vega pulled his talisman free, a twisted thing of bone and silver that hurt to look at directly, and words spilled from his lips in a language that predated Christ and civilization. The very air around him began to warp and twist, shadows taking on substance and malice. But Indy was already moving. She flowed across the space between them like water finding its level, and where her feet touched the earth, things began to grow. Not the stunted, drought-poisoned vegetation that had struggled to survive 3 years of merciless sun, but something else entirely. Roses, black as midnight and beautiful as sin, their thorns sharp enough to cut glass, and their blooms pulsing with their own inner light. "You always were a show-off," Vega snarled, raising his talisman. Dark energy lashed out like a whip, but the roses simply absorbed it, growing larger and more vibrant with each attack. "Parlor tricks won't save you this time, Indira." "Indira." Tyson spoke her true name like a prayer, finally understanding why Indy Prescott had never quite fit the woman who'd stepped off that train. This wasn't some Eastern socialite playing at mystery. This was something far older, far more dangerous, and infinitely more precious than he'd dared imagine. The hired guns tried to flee, but the roses had already spread in a circle around the battleground, their thorns weaving together into an impenetrable barrier. Horses reared and screamed as supernatural terror overrode their training. One man tried to jump the growing wall of flowers and disappeared into their depths with a shriek that cut off too suddenly. "You killed my husbands," Indira said, advancing on Vega with steps that left frost flowers blooming in her wake. "You hunted me across 3 states, murdering anyone who dared to care for me, all because I wouldn't use my gifts to serve your ambitions." They were weak, Vega spat, pouring more power into his talisman until it glowed like a coal fresh from Hell's Forge. "Just like you'll be weak. Just like you always." His words cut off as Tyson's bullet took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his talisman flying into the roses. The moment it touched those impossible blooms, the twisted thing began to smoke and crack, whatever dark power it contained bleeding away into petals that drank corruption like wine. "My fight," Tyson said simply, moving to stand beside Indira, with his gun still trained on Vega. "My bride. My choice." The remaining hired guns made their play then, drawing iron with the desperate speed of men who knew they were already dead. But Indira raised her hand, and the roses responded to her call. Thorny vines erupted from the earth, wrapping around gun barrels and wrists, not quite gentle enough to avoid drawing blood, but not quite cruel enough to be called murder. In the sudden silence that followed, Vega clutched his wounded shoulder and laughed, a sound like breaking glass and dying dreams. "You think this is over? You think killing me will end what I started? I don't plan to kill you," Indira said, kneeling to retrieve something from among the roses, a single black bloom whose petals seemed to hold starlight. "Death would be too kind for what you've done." She pressed the flower to her lips, whispered words in that same ancient language Vega had used, and blew across the petals. They scattered on the wind like dark snow, settling on Vega's skin despite his attempts to brush them away. "What did you do?" he demanded, but his voice was already changing, becoming hoarse and strained. "I gave you what you always wanted," Indira replied, rising gracefully. "Power over others. You'll live for centuries now, Ronan, but you'll never age past this moment. And you'll spend every one of those years feeling exactly what your victims felt. Their fear, their pain, their desperation. Every moment of suffering you caused will echo in your bones until the stars burn out." Vega tried to speak, tried to curse her, but his voice was already fading. The roses began to withdraw, pulling back into the earth as if they'd never existed, leaving only normal desert scrub and a handful of men who would wake in the morning wondering if they'd shared the same impossible dream. But Vega remained, frozen. In that moment between heartbeats, his eyes wide with the dawning understanding of what eternity would hold for him. "The town will find him at sunrise," Indira said, turning away from her defeated enemy. "They'll think he had some kind of fit. Doctors will call it a seizure or a stroke. He'll live, but he'll never hurt anyone again." Tyson holstered his gun and studied the woman who'd just redefined everything he thought he knew about power and justice. "The stories about your husbands, all true, in their way." She smiled, but there was sadness in it now, old grief that had learned to wear hope like borrowed clothes. "They loved me, and I loved them, and love made them careless. Made them try to protect me from things they couldn't understand. Vega used that love against them, against me. And now," Indira stepped closer, close enough that he could see his reflection in eyes that held depths no human gaze should possess. "Now I'm tired of running, tired of being afraid, tired of letting evil men dictate the terms of my existence." She reached up and touched his face with fingers that still carried winter's chill, and Tyson felt something shift inside his chest, walls he'd built to protect himself crumbling at her touch. "I'm not an easy woman to love, Tyson Beck. I come with shadows and secrets, with power that frightens good people and draws the attention of bad ones. Are you sure you want to tie your fate to mine?" He caught her hand in his, turning it to press a kiss to her palm. "Lady, I've been waiting my whole life for someone brave enough to match me. I think you'll do just fine." When their lips met, three things happened at once. The drought broke as clouds gathered from a clear sky. Every remaining flower in Copper Canyon bloomed out of season, and somewhere in the distance, church bells began to ring though no human hand had touched the ropes. Love, it seemed, was the strongest magic of all. Well now, if that don't beat all. A cursed bride and a stubborn cowboy finding their happy ending in the most unlikely place. If you enjoyed this tale of desert roses and midnight justice, hit that like button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. I'd be mighty obliged to hear from folks far and wide. Until next time, may your own love story be blessed with just enough magic to keep things interesting.